When I was in high school, I struggled in trying to determine a career path for my future. At that time, schools are different now. They offer a lot more guidance when it comes to careers, assessment, tests, various aptitude inventories, and so forth. But back then, I don't think I even met with my guidance counselor once my whole high school career. So I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. So coming to this decision was not an easy one. The only thing that I had any kind of skill at that I was comfortable with was the drawing that I did. But I wasn't sure that I could make a living doing that. I mean, after all, how many Norman Rockwells are there, or Monets, or people like that? And that's fine art. How do you make a living at that? It takes a lot of years of sacrificing before you can sort of gain traction and become known for your talent. But a turning point came for me my last year of high school in art class. My art teacher asked me if I'd ever considered going to school to be a medical illustrator. I don't remember why she mentioned that, but she did, and it kind of piqued my interest. I ended up not going that route, mostly because of the amount of schooling that was involved with it, but it did engender and start an interest I had in human anatomy that I have to this day. I find the human body very fascinating in its complexity and what God has designed. And there are a lot of really interesting things when it comes to the human body. For instance, did you know that a human baby, has 64 more bones in their body than an adult does? Most of that is because bones have not fused and aids in the birth of the baby. And some of them, ironically, are not even there to begin with. Kneecaps are missing, for instance, in babies initially. But it isn't until we mature physically in our mid-20s or so that we have our final complement of about 206 bones. This also continues, this difference continues in other ways between babies and adults. The proportion of different types of cells in the human body changes with age as well. Newborns have about 25% muscle tissue by weight, meaning 25% of their weight is muscle. And they have about 13% of nerve tissue in the brain by weight. Conversely, an adult has 43% of muscle tissue by weight. We're much bigger, those muscles have developed, but also then, and you can make of this what you want, nerve tissue by brain weight is only 2% in adults compared to 13% in children. Most of that is just the proportions. It sounds odd to say it that way, but there are a lot of other interesting things, and we set the stage here today. The question I have there on the screen: what is the only bone in the human body that is not connected to or touching another bone? A few people know it. It's called the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone, if you can see on my illustration there, sits right below the jaw on top of the larynx. It's not connected to any other bone by cartilage or tissue or muscle. It's completely unique in that way. Completely necessary, but still unique. And so that leads me into what we want to talk about today. Scripture draws a great analogy between our physical human bodies and the spiritual body of which God has made us all a part. Today we're going to take a look at this. We're going to expand on this analogy and draw out some points concerning our spiritual roles and functions. And as you see there on the screen, our title is simply Our Spiritual Body. Let me give you some more numbers here. You might be impressed with this one. The human body is made up of more than 10 million cells. That's 10 with 12 zeros following it. Pretty large number. Those cells make up all the groups and systems of various things that serve to give us life. We have the skeletal system, we have the muscular system, the digestive system, the nervous system, reproductive and cardiovascular systems, but all of those systems have subsystems as well. For instance, the muscular system has voluntary and involuntary muscles. The voluntary muscle would be like your bicep. To choose to pick something up, your brain tells your muscle to move. Involuntary is your heart muscle. You don't have to think about that, fortunately, to make it beat. It just does it on its own. All of these systems also have specialized functions, and they even have specialized systems within themselves. In other words, our human bodies are multifaceted and multi-complex. Considering that, then what about our spiritual body? What is it that God's creating with the body that He's made us part of? There's a lot that we want to look at, so let's get into that. Romans 12, let's begin there today. Paul had a fair amount to say about this matter of bodies, spiritual bodies specifically, because he dealt with several congregations that were not working together very well. The Corinthian audience was one, the Corinth congregation. They had misunderstood and misapplied what God had given to them. And rather than working together, they were creating conflict. The body was not in harmony. In Romans 12 and verse 1, we read here, Paul writing, he says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable, which is your reasonable service. In other words, it's the least we can do. He says, and don't be conformed to this world, but transformed, by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove that which is good and acceptable in the perfect will of God. Be changed. That word transformed is metamorphosis. We're changed completely. Verse 3, for I say, though through grace that is given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Now, this is not talking about a proper, healthy aspect of self-esteem. This is talking about looking at ourselves and saying what we're doing needs to be more or different than what we are. That creates problems. We'll come back to that in a moment. He says, but to think soberly, as God has dealt each one a measure of faith. For as we have many members in one body, again, we have muscles, we have bone, we have tendons, we have all kinds of cells in our body doing all kinds of different things. As we have many members in one body, spiritually as well, but all the members do not have the same function. So considering your body, what would you give up? What would you say is not necessary? Now, one of the really awesome things about what God has done in giving us this life, these bodies that we have, is that they're extremely adaptable. I mean, look at us and the weather we live in. Okay, you bring somebody from Arizona or Florida up here, and they're going to have a really hard time. But we're kind of used to it, aren't we, unfortunately? I say that. I don't like being used to it. But even if we think more seriously, people that have lost their sight or lost their hearing or lost an appendage, we can still function. We don't function the way we were designed to, but we can still manage. Spiritually, we do the same. We don't all have the same function. So, verse 5, being many, we are one body in Christ and individually members one of the other. We are so codependent. And even in the human body, when it doesn't work together, we have illness or we have disease. That it affects all kinds of other things in the body. When we get a head cold, it doesn't just make our head feel miserable, our whole body hurts. When we get something like that, we're reminded of how much everything works together. But even in terms of a spiritual body, how would we see this? We can tell when someone's healthy for the most part, at least up and about, but it's a sad thing to visit somebody that's housebound or in the hospital because of some scenario going on, and you can see they're hurting. Well, how do we know when it works right spiritually? Well, we see people serving the body. Just like aspects of our body, doesn't ask permission, doesn't have to be told, not the way God designed it. It simply does. It functions. Well, spiritually, do we see people who are serving? We do. And we serve in a variety of ways. We can have greeters at the door here. We can have people that put bulletins together. We can have people that call and ask people how they're doing, or they stop by and drop off food. Or we can have various aspects of physical things, the setup and whatnot that goes on for services. Pardon me. In a physical body, no one, as I said, demands to be noticed unless there's something wrong. Then you stub that toe, and it's going to demand your attention. It just does, because it's hurting. But when things are working the way they should, then we don't see those demands. But we need to also make sure that we're not forgetting them. Do we serve the body because we care, or do we serve because we seek recognition? Let's continue here in Romans 12, verse 6. Having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, let us use them, that is the gifts, let us use them if It is prophecy. Let us prophesy in proportion to our faith. Prophecy is not just foretelling future events. Prophecy is also preaching or teaching God's word. Some people are very good at that. He continues here. He says, or in ministry. This is serving specifically. In serving, let us use it as serving. He who teaches in teaching, he who exhorts in exhortation, he who gives with liberality, he who leads with diligence, he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. In other words, whatever we're doing, like Ecclesiastes 9:10 says, to do it to our best ability. But living up to verse 8 can be very underappreciated, that we do it with everything we have. You know, one of the really sad things, humanly, is that if we don't keep the right perspective, then people get tired of doing things and they pull back. But looking at this in a positive aspect, do you see members serving the body in all these different ways? This is just a partial list. I'll give you an insight here. If you don't know where to serve, just listen. Have a conversation with somebody. Never underestimate the effect just listening to someone will have. Because most of us don't get opportunity to have those kind of honest discussions. There was a fellow years ago in the Cincinnati area when I was a boy. It was not put this way, but he was the kind of individual that if he asked you, how are you doing? That was not a throwaway comment. He really wanted to know how you were doing. Those kind of people, those kind of comments and actions can really make a difference. Even just getting cards. You know, we all love to get cards, don't we? These cards that were given to me to read to you. People genuinely appreciate these things. And I think increasingly in the culture around us, because it's not done very much, it really has more impact. But as I've alluded to, our bodies are fearfully and wonderfully made. We don't give much thought to them until they don't work right. And the same is true spiritually. God has blessed us with an awesome family to be a part of. We work best as a church when we fulfill our roles, our different roles as God has placed us in the body. Let's go to Ephesians 4 there on the screen. Ephesians 4 and verse 1. Paul's talking here again about this matter of unity, and later he talks about walking in, or not walking, but using our spiritual gifts properly. So Ephesians 4 and verse 1, he says, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling in which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long-suffering, bearing with one another in love. This aspect of service, of being there for someone. Endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Verse 4, there is one body, one Spirit. There are not two churches of God. There's only one, really. At this point in time, it's up to God to determine if those individuals are part of his body, but unfortunately Satan's done a great job of fragmenting God's church. But there's really only one, because there's only one Spirit, as he says here, just as you were called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. It is God who sustains our life physically, and it is even more so God who sustains us spiritually. Verse 7, but to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gifts. Verse 11, he himself gave some to be, and these are responsibilities. I don't see this as a hierarchy here. He gave some to be apostles and prophets and evangelists and some pastors and teachers. Notice verse 12, all of this is for the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. We have hands and arms and feet and legs and heads and so forth. All of it is for us to have the life that God wants us to have so that we can learn to be like him, physically even. Verse 13, till we come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature and fullness of Christ. Even physically, we grow and we mature. We're unique in a lot of ways in that maturity. In the animal world, a lot of animals have to mature very quickly. They don't have a long time to grow up because they need to be able to take care of themselves, usually within a year. They still may be young, but they're on their own. I mean, humanly, we take a couple of decades to get there. But still, even spiritually, we're to come to this unity. We grow into it. There are other interesting things we can talk about, even in terms of our bodies. Our faces are very interesting. We have, depending on how you count them, 44 to 80 muscles. There are all kinds of nerves and blood vessels that thread through the skull, through the jaw in different layers. You have bone, you have cartilage, you have skin that's overlaid on all of this, so that the face can twist and pull into about 5, depending on how you count them, 5,000 to 7,000 possible expressions. The human face is very expressive. The smile is probably the most recognizable signal in the world of this welcoming gesture, but it also can have much more complex behavior behind it. Scientists, there are actually people who study this, say that there's about 19 identified versions of just a smile. And they all have different meanings, but they all engage slightly different groups of muscles in order to make that smile. One of probably the more famous is what's called the Duchenne smile. What's interesting about the Duchenne smile is they've recognized that it is a smile that's sincere, because it will engage muscles around the eye, the orbicularis oculi. So on this example, if you notice, the eyes crinkle differently. When the eyes crinkle, it's a sincere smile, because there are people who can smile that are not sincere. And so this fascinates scientists, because the Duchenne smile is an involuntary reaction. Do you think about crinkling your eyes when you smile? So this is just an interesting aside, just some of the subtleties that God gives us in this body. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 12 next. We continue this discussion that Paul is having about the different roles of the body. In 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 4, he says, there are diversities of gifts. Again, the Corinthian audience, they were having problems because the gifts God had given them, the role within the body, they were using to create division, not unity. Some would say, well, my gift is better than your gift, or my gift shows that I'm more spiritual than you are. They used it to measure against each other instead of serving one another. And he's reminding them here that it all comes from the same Spirit. There are differences of ministries, serving, but the same Lord. There are diversities of actions, but it's the same God who works in all. There are different systems within our bodies. And again, when they don't work right, what do we have? We call it illness, or it's disease. Something is not working right within the body. The body is fighting against itself, or it can't fight off outside influences. And so Paul was taking them to task for this. And so he continues, but the manifestation of the Spirit is given to each one for the profit of all. I asked earlier, what part of your body would you choose if you had to? What would you choose to get rid of? Well, spiritually, what part of the spiritual body could we get rid of? So he goes through this list. To one's given the word of the wisdom through the Spirit, to another the word of knowledge by the same Spirit, to another the faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healings, the working of miracles, to another prophecy, the discerning of spirits. There are some people that are very good about discerning, and sometimes it's scary. But you know what a lot of it comes down to, scientists are finding out, is they know, whether they realize it or not, they know how to read a lot of those expressions. And they see what's going on under them. Verse 12, for as the body is one and has many members, but all the members of that one body, being many, are one body, so also is Christ. So from our youngest to our oldest, we're all necessary. We're all part of this body God is creating. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body. There is to be no division. There is to be no separation. There is to be no contention. Because again, when a body is doing that, there are great problems. I have a picture there on the screen of red blood cells and white blood cells. Every drop of blood, if you ever prick your finger, cut it, every drop of blood contains more than 5 million red cells in it. It contains about 10,000 white cells, and it contains about 250,000 platelets. Now, the red cells contain hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is an iron compound, and what's unique about iron that helps our body is that oxygen binds very readily to iron, which is why you get rust in iron. But in our bodies, how are you going to move all that oxygen around for that energy? You bind it to the red blood cell. The white blood cells combat bad bacteria, viruses, other infections, and so they're the defense. They're with the blood as it circulates in the body, so it can be wherever it needs to be. And then the blood platelets help to clot blood. This is a conundrum for evolutionists, because if the blood didn't clot, the very first cut you got, no matter how sincere, or how minimal, I should say, you would eventually bleed out. The heart muscle connected to this that pumps all that blood is unique in that it never tires, and I'm grateful that it doesn't. But it's been estimated that in a lifespan of about 70 years, a person's heart beats about 2,000, let me say that a different way, 2,500 million times. Which means that it pumps about 60 million gallons of blood. That's quite the circulation system. In Genesis 9:4, we're not going to read that, but we're told by God that life is in the blood. This is why we don't eat blood. It's sacred to God. It's very unique in what God has enabled it to do. But think of our spiritual bodies as well. Where do we get our blood? Who is the blood of the body? The blood sacrificed for the body is Christ. We have about 12,000 million nerve cells in our body, linked by about 10 million connections. As we saw last week in the seminars here, one of the really sad things regarding dementia and Alzheimer's is that what brings that on is those nerve cells die. And when those connections die, then the brain around it shrinks. But all of that all those nerve cells, all those connections, all that computing power involves electricity. Any idea how much is used? For each of those nerve impulses, you use about 0.1 volts, which means for our brain to do its normal course of action, it requires a mere 10 watts of energy. So all of you are dim watts. But think of the efficiency of that. Our phones use more power than that. What if the body decided it didn't want to work together anymore? Bodies can do that. What do we call that? We call it cancer. When a cell starts dividing too quickly, or it divides in a mutated way, or it divides in a way that creates problems for the other cells around it, it's cancer. It doesn't last very long. It creates problems. If it's not cancer, then it's disease. The muscles. What if the muscles decided that the nervous system didn't know what was best? When would they know how to move? The cardiovascular system decided it didn't need to work all the time. It's going to take a break. You can see the kind of chaos that would cause. And what about our spiritual families? We all need to work together. The eye itself is a problem for evolutionists. You like Mike up there? To me, this is a great illustration. Let's read this, continuing here in 1 Corinthians 12, verse 15. It says, if the foot should say, because I'm not of the hand, I'm not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? I mean, what kind of body would we have? And if the ear should say, because I am not the eye and I'm not of the body, is it not of the body? If the whole body were an eye, I mean, this is why it's a cartoon, isn't it? How would that even work? Where would be the hearing? If the whole were the hearing, where would be the smelling? Okay, so he doesn't have a nose, does he? Smelling's important. We don't think about it very often, not just to give us a sense of our environment. You know, one of the important functions of smelling is so we taste our food. If you can't smell, you ever had a really bad head cold and you eat something, it doesn't taste like anything, does it? You lose your appetite real quick. This is why God put these sort of things in here. In verse 18, but now God has set the members, each one of them, in the body as he pleased, where we would work best to serve the body. And so then we have the body that God has given us. Verse 23, and those members of the body which we think to be less honorable, on these we bestow greater honor. You know, we spend an awful lot of time grooming our bodies. And it's necessary, but do we spend the same amount of time taking care of other parts of our body? I know I don't at times. He says, to continue there in verse 23, and our unpresentable parts have greater modesty, but our presentable parts have no need. Not no need, it's just not the same need in terms of the body having to function. So, I mean, if we lost every bit of hair on our body, would it change how the body functioned? In a very small way. Mostly it'd be an appearance. But it's not like losing a hand, is it? Or losing a sense. Verse 26, and if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. Like that little toe. It's not localized in the toe. That pain, any pain. You have a tooth that's impacted. You have a cut. I mean, it's amazing how much pain a paper cut can generate on a finger. It's because it's usually on that surface we use all the time. So then we're constantly rubbing it until it heals. That's why we should ache even spiritually for those that hurt. We're all part of that body. We should all feel the same thing. Verse 25, that there should be no schism in the body, no division, that the members should have the same care one for another. There are great analogies here. And as a church, I think we're still learning to appreciate each other more in the roles we have in serving. Again, different functions, but we're all part of the same body. Not everybody's going to be able to be here behind a lectern speaking. Not everybody's going to have the same ability to serve in physical ways. Not everybody's going to have the same time maybe to make phone calls or the same heart, if you will, to write the cards, to take the time and put something meaningful behind the words. But we all don't have to. That's the beauty of a body, right? We have the areas that specialize in these things, that take care of them. And it doesn't mean that we don't overlap. We'll come to that here in a little bit. But Paul mentions here that the foot can't decide it's not part of the body. And if it left, then where would that leave the body? Compromised. Over the years, I've had some that have left the body, that left a great hole in my life because they had such a great impact. And that's always a sad thing. We need to make sure that we don't marginalize based on what people are doing. Years ago, we did that some. There were some years ago in Worldwide that sort of derided the membership, that they were there just to pay and pray, as the phrase was put. But as I said this morning to Oshkosh, I have learned over the years that if I truly want God to bless something, and I want to know if God's behind something, ask the widows to pray for it. Because God seems to have a special place in his heart for them, and they have the time, and it seems by that point in life, you have a different perspective. And so you go to God in a different way. And he hears those prayers more often than not. We all can serve in different ways. We need to find out what that is if we don't know. And that's not so hard to do, but we all have a responsibility and a part to play in being part of this spiritual body. Let's go on to 1 Peter 4. 1 Peter 4 and verse 8, Peter here is mentioning very similar things. He says, and above all things, have fervent love one for another. For love will cover a multitude of sins. And this love is not talking about condoning wrong behavior or ignoring it. What this is talking about is loving the person so that as God works with them, that sin or whatever it is does not define them, does not become what they're known for. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling. Care for one another, that it's not an obligation I have to do. Why do I have to do this? You don't have to do it, but as part of the body, we should want to. As each one has received a gift, minister it to one another. Use whatever talent God has given us, ability God has given us. You know, this area is blessed in so many ways. We have so many good speakers that can contribute. We have so many people that are talented musically. There are so many congregations out there that don't even have a pianist. It's nice that we can use those things to serve one another. Verse 11, if anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God, meaning from his word. If anyone ministers, let him do it with the ability which God supplies, that in all things God may be glorified. God gave us these bodies. That's why we're not to abuse them. This is where his Spirit dwells. And so we should take care of it. To the point I have referenced on there on the screen, Galatians 5, 22 through 26. Those are the fruit of the Spirit. What I always find very intriguing about that section, notice it says the fruit of the Spirit, singular. It's like the body. It all has to be there to work together. What one fruit of the Spirit would you not have without it all being compromised? They all work together. They all have a role. Gentleness, goodness, faith. Can you have those without humility? Love, joy, peace. Can you have that without gentleness? They all have to work together. Another aspect of our human body is the liver. We don't think about this very often. It's not a very big organ in terms of body weight, percentage of weight, but it's the largest organ in the body, minus the skin, if you count the skin as an organ. But in terms of internal organs, the liver is the largest. It performs roughly around 500 different chemical reactions needed in the body. It produces substances needed for digestion, for blood clotting, for storing food materials such as glycogen. It purifies blood of toxins such as alcohol or drugs. This is why we have to be careful, even with things like Advil, ibuprofen, because that centers in the liver. Too much of it can hurt the liver. What's interesting about the liver is that it weighs about 4 pounds. Like I said, so in terms of body weight, it's not very large. But in those 4 pounds, it contains about 25% of the total volume of your blood. So at any one time, a quarter of your blood supply is in your liver. That's how vital an organ it is. It collects hemoglobin from dying blood cells, recirculates them into the bone marrow to be incorporated into new blood cells. Can the liver stand on its own? No, it cannot. Do we have problems and struggles in the church because we don't yield to one another in this body through the spirit of the fruits of the Spirit? Maybe. But it doesn't mean we have to stay there. We simply work together better. You're feeling sick, you go to bed. You let the body heal. You're hungry, you eat. You know, if you're like me, it's first breakfast, first lunch, second lunch. Probably shouldn't do that as much as I do, but Galatians 2, let's go there next. I'm sorry, I said the wrong thing, Colossians 2:18. Paul says, let no one cheat you of your reward. In Revelation, I believe it is, we're told to let no man take your crown. We can only allow someone to do that. Don't let someone cheat you of your reward, taking delight in false humility and worship of angels as an example he uses. This was a problem even at this time in Colossae. You know, letting someone divide the body. Don't do that. Don't let that happen. Intruding into those things which he has not seen, vainly puffing up by this fleshly mind. You know, it's amazing the arguments people will get into. Can we eat honey? Really? Okay, the argument is because the bee is not something we can eat. Okay, so then the argument comes back, well, what about all the references in Scripture? So then the argument is returned. Well, depending on how you look at that word, it can also mean tree sap and some of these other things. Really? We're still going to argue this? All the medicinal properties of honey, all that's known. Okay, so explain to me how that tree grew up in that lion that Samson killed. Right? He ate honey out of the carcass. But we get twisted on things like that, losing sight of what it is that we're supposed to be about. The body. This body, learning to become like God, learning to work together, because we're going to be working together for eternity. This body has a limited lifespan, and there are no guarantees. We can die very young, we can die a ripe old age, but eventually we all die. What is it we're going to learn out of this life? This is what we're supposed to be paying attention to. It works best together in humility. Sorry, I lost my place. Let me get back to my notes here. Okay, so verse 19, not holding fast to the head, that is, letting these individuals take our mind off of the head. You know, we can lose a lot of appendages, fingers, hands, arms, almost everything out of the core, but if we lose our head, it's all done. Spiritually, it is very much the same. If we lose our head, we're done. I've seen too many people allow that. Going back to the beginning of verse 18, letting them someone cheat them out of what God has in mind for them. Because notice in verse 19, everything comes from the head. All of it is nourished and knit together by joints and ligaments. It grows with the increase that is from God. Everything in this life is from God. This is the shame, if you will, of what's in the world around us. We think we generate these things. We think we can fix problems. We think we are the ones that accomplish. We can't do anything that God hasn't started. The food, the air, the water, this very life, none of it would exist if God hadn't given it to us. And so we're to nourish it, as it says in verse 19, hold these things together. Value what God increases in that. Verse 20, therefore, if you died with Christ from the basic principles of the world, that is, we left that behind, what the world had to offer was nothing. It's death. If we left that behind, then why, as though living in the world, do you subject yourself to regulations? And the congregation at Colossae was doing this. He mentioned some of them in verse 21. Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle. This ascetic lifestyle, that if I deny the flesh, that I make myself profitable spiritually. That's not what God is asking us to do. You know, part of the problem with dieting is that if you deny yourself, eventually the body rebels. I'm not going to do that anymore. You know, I've had kale up to here, I'm not doing it anymore. You know, whatever. I'm going to ask God one day, why didn't he make all the good stuff taste like chocolate? Right? Then there'd be no problem. I know, I'm being a little facetious here, but this is what we're supposed to hold on to, is the head, not these silly regulations of things. We get backwards. He even talks about it in Romans. We worship the creation rather than the Creator. We need to make sure that we're focused on the right things. And this spiritual body is of preeminence. Our role in it, our function, whether we support each other, where we acknowledge God's role in what He has given us, and then our responsibility back to Him. We need to have the humility in whatever role we have in the body. God tells us here in Colossians, through Paul, that He will give us a reward in the body. But will He reward us if we struggle to be a hand when we need to be a foot, or whatever the case may be? Is a physical body at peace when one member of that body, one part of that body, is out of sync with the rest of the body? Too many of you know the answer to that. It's not at peace. Let's go to Ephesians 5:21. Paul's not directly talking about this analogy that we're discussing here today, but he sets the stage in verse 21 to reiterate the point I just made. Because from here, then, he goes to talk about the proper roles and relationships of a husband and a wife. But in verse 21, he simply says, submit to one another, in the fear of God. Submit to where you are. There are a lot of people in the culture around us that say, well, women shouldn't have to submit to a husband. A wife shouldn't have to submit to a husband. Well, maybe not the way it's been done in too many cases, in a wrong way, but God still has placed authority within the relationship. We'll have to ask God why He did particular things in particular ways, but even with the body, Why did he do it the way he did? You know, watch science fiction movies, and they come up with all kinds of ideas of how life could function. And that's an interesting exercise. If you were going to create life, how would you design it? That's really all these science fiction creators are doing. How would you picture life? There are any number of ways you could go. Why did he do it this way? Well, our eyes, in many ways, I suspect, he probably placed them where he did, designed them to be where they are on the body the way he did, is because it gives us the best field of vision, gives us the best depth of field. Our nose is placed right over our mouth. It's a wonderful thing. Again, we smell so much of what we eat before we even take a bite of it. Let's move on to the next one here. The skeletal system I mentioned earlier doesn't just have one function. What's interesting in a body is that almost nothing does. Everything has multiple functions. And so to look at this analogy here in the body, we're going to look at the skeletal system. It doesn't just give our body a framework. I'm glad it does, but that's not its only job, because if we didn't have our bones, we'd just be bags of mush on the floor, wouldn't we? We wouldn't be able to move anywhere. But the bones have a number of jobs. They're storehouses for a number of minerals, such as calcium. In fact, if you're not getting enough calcium, this is a problem especially for older women, if you're not getting enough calcium, your body will take it out of your bones, and then you have a problem. They're also, the bones, that is, they're also factories that produce red and white blood cells. We talked about that earlier and what that does. Our bones also protect vital internal organs. Part of how God designed our bodies is that when you look at, for instance, our core, look at all the bones we have protecting those organs to make sure that they're as safe as they can be. We have vertebrae that are stacked in such a way to give us maximum flexibility. We're one of the few animals that can touch every part of their body with one appendage, which is a really interesting thing when you think about it. Now, as we get older, we may not be that flexible, but ideally we can. Our ribs protect things, as I mentioned. Our roles within the body don't have to be one-dimensional. We're not stuck. Even as we age, we do things differently. You know, spiritually, it's no different. How do you transition, just using this as an example, how do you transition a deacon out of being a deacon? It's not a throwaway question. You have a guy that's 80 years old that's been a deacon for 50 years. How do you transition him out of that? He's not going to have the strength to do a lot of things that he had done before. Does it mean that he can't be a deacon? The counsel that I received, I think is very sound advice, is that you now use him to teach other men how to be deacon. And that's a wonderful thing. Your brain is very plastic. It can train itself to do all kinds of things. It can learn all kinds of new things. But that's the problem as we get older. We only have so much space, and so we push some stuff out to learn other things. No, not really. Let's go next to Hebrews chapter 10. I believe that God is doing a different work with his church today than he was doing 30, 40 years ago. And what I mean by that is that I think he's preparing the bride for his son. And this is part of what I'm driving at here today. I think we do a better job of considering one another and considering our role when working together than we did years ago. We might have served in other ways, in better ways in some of those cases, but service will end. This is what Paul said about these various gifts, right? Gift of prophecy is going to fail. At some point it won't be needed. When we're all spirit beings, what about the gift of healing? We won't need that. Gift of prophecy, you won't need that. The gift of teaching, at that point, will all be in the family or not. But to know how to work together, we'll never get past that. It will always be needed. So Hebrews 10 and in verse 23, we read here, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering." The calling that God has given us, the place in the body he has given us, the roles that we have, whatever those are, and they will change over time. Let us hold fast to those things. For he who promised is faithful. Let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works. Is the body in need of fuel? The stomach rumbles and the brain says, oh yeah, I've got to eat. Do we see a need and let people know about it and take care of it? To consider one another. The old King James says provoke. There are times when we need to do that. There are times our body says, look, enough, not going to do any more of this. The weekend warrior. We get up Monday, we say, oof, and the body says, yeah, don't do that again real soon. Verse 25, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. Have you ever stopped to think that when you're not here, whoever it is, whenever someone is not here, it's not just that you're not coming before God, the body is not whole without you. Again, what part is not necessary of the body? Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. And the day is the end time. Going back to verse 24, the considering one another, the provoking one another, that we are going to stand together. Who was the famous American patriot that said, if we don't stand together, we most surely will hang separately? I want to say Franklin, but I don't think that was it. Anyway, the body is best when it's working together, isn't it? Even in terms of the end time, how much of that do you want to do on your own? And how much of it do you want to do with others of like mind surrounded, helping, supporting, encouraging, defending? I would pick the latter. This is part of why we pray for one another as well. Those are not throwaway things that I send out, and I don't mean to imply that you think they are. I'm just saying we need to remember why. The body is hurting. To pray for one another. Those cards that I read, when I visit people, for them to know that you're praying for them, that you are remembering them, means a lot. If you've never been in that situation, it's hard to explain, but when you have been, you understand then. You know. There are things that doctors still don't know, scientists still don't understand in terms of our body. It's such a wonderfully complex and amazing thing that God has created in us. For instance, anesthesia. How many of you have had surgery requiring anesthesia? Okay, see a fair amount. They have no idea how that works. They only know that it does. Now, the problem is that it works differently for everybody. You may have heard some of the stories of people that wake up during surgery because the anesthesia didn't stick, if you will. Their body processed it too quickly. There are some people that cannot go under anesthesia. It creates a stress on their system. Their body wants to shut down, which is not a good thing, as you can imagine. There are other people like me that you give me a little bit and I'm dead until I wake up. But they don't know how that works. There's so many things in the body. They don't understand how it works. In the spiritual body, do we understand everything that works? We're going to have a lot of interesting conversations with Christ and the Father, aren't we? Why did you do it that way? What did I miss? Even though we did it, I understand some of the things. Why did you do it that way? Why did God place us where he has? I don't know, we'll have to ask those questions at some point, but the point is that we do need to be working together. Luke 11 up there, I won't read that for the sake of time, but it talks about the eye being the light of the body. What's interesting is that even with illness or sickness, a lot of times there are many, many things that can be diagnosed through the eye. But we even talk about the eye being the windows of the soul, to see someone. You can see sort of how they're thinking, whether they're upset, kind of mood they're in. You can ascertain a lot of things about the personality through the eyes, like that Duchenne smile, whether they're sincere or not. God is looking at us the same way. Our physical bodies work best when all the systems are working together, when they're working in harmony. when they're working the way God designed them to be. And our spiritual body is no different. And as I mentioned, I think this is one of the great lessons God is teaching his church presently. Are we working together? Will we be in unity and harmony? Will we have humility and submit to one another? Let's read last verse there, Romans 12. Romans 12 and verse 9. Let love be without hypocrisy. Let it be sincere. Let it be without an agenda, without something behind it. Love, just in a purest sense, abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. I mean, think about this in terms of not only spiritual body, but in your physical body, to take care of things the way they should be taken care of, just for the sake of everything working together the best way it can. Be kindly affectioned to one another with brotherly love. In honor, giving preference to one another. Doesn't matter where we are in the body. Do we serve one another? Do we give honor to each other? Not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer. Some of the things that I've talked about already. That we remember each other, that we go to God for each other. I firmly believe that God listens to our prayers for others differently than he listens to the prayers for us. And I'm not saying that we can't pray for ourselves. But when we show God we care for others first, I think he's going to hear us differently. Distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality. And this doesn't just mean having people over for dinner. This is hospitality and generosity, being hospitable in everything that we do. Bless those who persecute you, and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Feel the body. When you wake up and you've had a really good night's sleep, it just feels different, doesn't it? You can conquer the world. When you had a miserable night's sleep, you wake up and you want to just go back to bed. You know, our spiritual body is no different. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind towards one another, which is what? The love, the humility. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Remember what it is that God has given us and what we're to do with it and where we have come from, because we are the temple. 1 Corinthians 3, this is where God, once we repent, come to repentance, become baptized, submit and yield to him in everything that we do, then God places his Spirit in us and we become part of his temple, his body, where he dwells. Let me leave you with one last fact, which I find very interesting. An average male that weighs about 150 pounds, just using a number, will in the course of a lifetime eat approximately 150 tons of food. Just a man at 150 pounds. If you're larger or smaller, woman, those vary. But just stop and think about that. 150 tons of food. We have an adage, we say, you are what you eat. Physically, food makes a huge difference in our health. Spiritually, it is everything as well. We are what we eat spiritually. How much spiritual food are we eating to maintain the functionality we are to have in the body? I can't answer that for you. You have to answer that. But it's something to consider as we move forward to the Spring Holy Days. It's important for us to take our role in the body seriously so that we all work together in harmony. Let's be about that business.